In 2021, a small family brewery in Gloucestershire was quietly running out of road. 50 pubs on its books, a loyal little following, and no real path to becoming anything bigger. Then two men joined the business, and neither of them had ever brewed a pint in his life. 3 years later, that same brewery is selling beer in 9 countries. Here's the part almost nobody tells you. Jeremy Clarkson didn't build this business from nothing. He walked into one that already existed, brought in exactly the right second person, and what happened next is a far more useful story than the one you've probably heard. Quick thing before we go further, if you like business stories with the myths stripped out and the real mechanics left in, hit subscribe now because this channel does one of these every week. Here's what most retellings leave out entirely. Back in 2005, a couple named Emma and Rick Keene started a small operation called Cotswold Brewing Company. For 16 years, they did what most craft breweries do. They survived. Decent reviews, a loyal handful of local drinkers, a modest run of pub contracts, and absolutely no household name recognition outside Gloucestershire. Rick Keene was the actual brewmaster, the person who understood fermentation temperatures and mash timings and everything else that turns barley into something drinkable. That expertise didn't arrive with Clarkson. It was already sitting in Bourton on the water, waiting for someone to notice it. By 2021, Clarkson had a barley surplus, a farm that had just made him one of the most recognizable faces in British television, and a decision to make about grain that the big lager contracts didn't want. He didn't build a factory, he didn't hire a brewmaster or apply for a license. He picked up the phone and partnered with a brewery that already had all of that sorted. What he brought to the table wasn't beer making skill, it was reach, timing, and a face that 11 million people already trusted on a Sunday night. What the Keenes brought was the machine that could actually turn that reach into a real product. Fame plus infrastructure. That's the entire formula, and almost nobody frames it that way, because underdog builds an empire from a leaky barn makes a better thumbnail than two complementary skill sets found each other at the right moment. But there's a third piece of this puzzle that gets almost no attention at all, and it might be the most important one in the entire story. His name is Johnny Hornby, and he has never driven a combine harvester on television. Before Hawkstone existed, Hornby spent 2 decades building one of Britain's most influential advertising careers. He started as a trainee at Ogilvy, working accounts for Ford and Guinness, moved through CDP handling Honda and Panasonic, then became managing director at TBWA, where his agency ran the advertising for Tony Blair's landslide 2001 general election victory. That same year, Hornby left to start his own agency with 2 colleagues, one of whom had built the reassuringly expensive Stella Artois campaign, one of the most quietly effective pieces of brand positioning in British advertising history. That agency grew into a global network of 1,800 people across 42 locations, and in 2024, Hornby sold his final stake in it to WPP, one of the largest advertising holding companies on earth. Sit with that resume for a second, because it recontextualizes everything. This is not a wealthy friend who agreed to co-sign a vanity project. This is a man who spent his entire career studying exactly how consumer trust gets built, sold, and scaled, choosing to put that expertise into a beer brand instead of another agency retainer. When people talk about Hawkstone's marketing being clever, the banned adverts, the viral farmer campaigns, the sudden appearances on supermarket shelves, they're describing Johnny Hornby's actual profession, quietly at work behind a famous face. Clarkson creates the organic moments, the little videos from the farm, the offhand comment that turns into a headline. Hornby builds the paid engine underneath it, engineered with the same rigor he once applied to national election campaigns. Most celebrity-branded products fail for one simple reason. There's nobody in the room who has actually done this before, at scale, under pressure, for decades. Hawkstone had someone who had done exactly that. If you're finding this useful, tap that like button. It genuinely helps a video like this reach more people, and there's a lot more of this story left to get through. You've probably heard the version where a stubborn farmer, furious at being rejected by the big lager companies, built an entire brewery out of sheer spite. It's a wonderful story. It's also missing its own middle chapter. The barley really was rejected by major brewing contracts. That much is true, and it's the emotional spark that makes the rest of the story land. But the leap from rejected grain to a brand now sitting on shelves across Europe wasn't a shed, a dream, and a stubborn Yorkshireman refusing to quit. It was buying into to a business that had spent 16 years quietly learning how to brew properly and then wiring a world-class advertising brain directly into its bloodstream. That's not a smaller achievement than the myth suggests. It's a different one, and it happens to be a far more useful one to actually learn from, because become one of the most famous people in the country first isn't a strategy anyone watching this can replicate on a Tuesday. Find the people who have already solved the hard parts of your problem and go into business with them is something anyone can act on. Here's where the story gets genuinely current, and where most videos covering this topic simply stop, because they're working from numbers that are already a year out of date. By March 2025, Hawkstone's filed accounts showed sales of £21.3 million. That's usually where the story ends online. It isn't where the story actually ends. In the year that followed, sales climbed again, reported at £44.9 million, with the company posting average annual growth above 128% across 3 consecutive years. Total equity in the business jumped from roughly £430,000 to more than $3 million in a single 12-month stretch. Cash in the bank grew nearly 6-fold over the same period. That is not a brand coasting on a television wave that will eventually crest and fall. That is a business compounding quarter after quarter in a category that is famously brutal to newcomers, and then it left the country entirely. By February 2026, Hawkstone had expanded into 9 European markets, including France, Italy, and the Netherlands, after selling 2.5 million pints online in the lead up to that push. Industry estimates now put the company's overall valuation at somewhere around £75 million. A brewery that was supplying roughly 50 pubs before Clarkson and Hornby got involved now supplies more than 4,000, and it's doing so while genuinely rattling brewers many times its size, who are now watching a Cotswold's operation eat into shelf space they used to take for granted. Here's the twist that almost nobody puts in the same breath as those numbers, and it's the part of this story I find most honest. While the brewery was posting 8-figure growth, reports on Clarkson's actual farming operation told a completely different story. Around the same period, his arable farming business posted a loss of roughly £5,000. The barley business, the very thing that supposedly started all of this, still doesn't reliably turn a profit on its own. Sit with that contradiction for a moment, because it's the real lesson hiding underneath the whole saga. The farm that inspired the brand is still fighting the exact economics that made British farming brutal in the first place. Thin margins, volatile subsidies, weather that refuses to cooperate on schedule. The brewery succeeded specifically by refusing to stay trapped inside that model. It took a raw, low-margin commodity, wrapped it in a brand people actually wanted to talk about, and let someone else's decades of distribution and advertising expertise carry the weight the farm alone never could. The lesson isn't grow better barley, it's know exactly which part of your business can never scale and build something else around it that can. In June 2026, Hawkstone hosted Cereals, one of the UK's largest agricultural events, at Diddley Squad itself, expecting around 25,000 farmers to walk the same fields that once produced barley nobody wanted. That's not a marketing stunt loosely bolted onto a beer brand for the optics. That's the brand becoming an actual gathering point for the industry it grew out of, hosting the very people whose crops it once couldn't sell. It's worth sitting with how strange and how deliberate that is. A product born from agricultural rejection is now literally hosting agriculture's biggest annual gathering on the same land where the rejection happened. So here's the version of this story worth actually remembering, the one that doesn't get flattened into a single feel-good headline. This was never purely a farming story with a beer attached to it for flavor, and it was never purely a celebrity project with a farm bolted on for authenticity either. It's a distribution business that happened to start with barley, built by 3 very different kinds of expertise landing in the same place at the same time. A brewery that had spent 16 years learning its craft in relative obscurity, a communication strategist who had spent 2 decades learning exactly how attention turns into loyalty at the highest level the advertising industry offers, and a famous face willing to actually show up week after week and make the whole thing feel real instead of manufactured. The popular myth is a furious farmer who built something out of pure stubbornness. The reality is quieter, messier, and considerably more useful to anyone actually trying to build something themselves. Know precisely what you're good at. Go find the people who've already mastered what you're not, and don't let anyone's ego, including your own, run the one part of the business it was never suited to run. If you want the next part of this story, what happens when a brewery this size collides head on with brewers 20 times its scale, subscribe, because that one's coming next.